U.S. air base in Sicily earlier this afternoon, touting his trip as a, quote, home run. Hello, everyone. Happy Saturday to you. Welcome to a brand new hour inside America's news headquarters.
And I'm Laura Ingle. President Trump wrapping up his tour with a strong message to U.S. troops. Mr. Trump telling service members stationed at the airbase in Sicily that he will never back down from the fight against global terrorism. Amy Kellogg live for us now in Italy. All right, Amy, how did the trip go on the ground?
Hi, Laura. Well, according to President Trump, as you mentioned, it was a home run. Not only that, but one of his senior advisors was saying that this reaffirmed America's global leadership abroad. They talked about all of these deals, $500 billion in deals signed in Saudi Arabia, then about a more firm and unified stance against terrorism that was agreed among people. Trump's advisors said that the meetings went well. They were warm, they were cordial, but it kind of depends who you speak to, because some here in Europe were talking about the G7 really being a G6+1, with that one being President Trump, as many of his ideas do diverge from some of the Europeans. However, France's newly elected centrist president, Emmanuel Macron, said that he praised Trump's capacity to listen and progress with the rest of the group. Trump, speaking to and thanking troops at the Sigonella Naval Air Station, claims that his tough talk earlier in the week on NATO members is paying off, though none of us are privy to the particular details of that particular home run.
Money is actually starting to pour into NATO from countries that would not have been doing what they're doing now had I not been elected. I can tell you that. Money is starting to pour in. It's only fair to the United States. We want to be treated fairly. And we're behind NATO all the way, but we want to be treated fairly.
What he's talking about, Laura, is simply that the other NATO members contribute 2% of their total budgets to their militaries. That is really the regulation, and apparently just 5 of NATO members to date are doing that. Laura.
Amy, you know, we've been hearing a lot about the Paris Climate Agreement. So where do the G7 leaders stand on that right now?
Well, yeah, when I talked about this G6+1, in the final communique, President Trump did not sign on with the rest of the G7 members about supporting those 2015 Paris Accords that President Obama signed on to. Those set limits on emissions and sort of guidelines for segueing into economies of clean energies. Trump said that he needs to go back home and give it just a little more thought, because, of course, the White House is really split about what to do. Trump's biggest concern, Laura, is that stringent limits on emissions will cost Americans jobs. So he just needs to try to figure out what the right thing to do is. So there was a bit of division there. Chancellor Merkel said it was kind of unsatisfactory. But next week we will see what President Trump decides. And finally, Laura, I would like to point out so much has been made about this extraordinary backdrop that you've been seeing these last few days in Sicily, in Taormina. But this really was chosen not so much for its beauty, but it was chosen by the Italians to highlight the issue of migration, because 1,500 migrants and refugees have drowned this year alone in these seas, trying to make it to Europe, make it to Italy. And Italy has really borne, to a large extent, the brunt of this, taking an expected 200,000 refugees this year. So Italy really wanted to say, look, help us with these refugees and help these refugees. And that issue maybe got a bit shrifted in these days because of so many other concerns, including terrorism, the leaders were discussing.
Great explanation. Thank you so much, Amy Kellogg, for us live in Italy. A very interesting time, a very important trip. Thank you so much for all of that. Greg.
You know, we've been gone for now a long time, everywhere I go, but we have been gone for close to 9 days. This will be 9 days, and I think we hit a home run no matter where we are.
President Trump calling his first overseas trips since taking office a success. How'd he do? Joining me now is Kelly Jane Torrance, Deputy Managing Editor for the Weekly Standard. Great to see you. You know, the thing a lot of people are talking about is President Trump scolding NATO members for not paying their fair share. Do you think he was right to call them out? I mean, after all, why should American taxpayers bear an excessive financial burden for a defense that, in many ways, benefits European countries more than the U.S.?
He does have a point here, but, you know, first of all, it's important to realize that the 2% guideline, that is a guideline. It's actually not a strict regulation. NATO says that members should do this. That's the guideline, but they don't have to. And, you know, Iceland, for example, they only spend 0.1% of their GDP on defense. They don't even have their own army. So it's going to take a while for them to even try to get close to that 2%. But it's important to also note that that is 2% of their budget, their GDP, to be spent on defense for themselves. And that is partly because that you need to have a strong, they need to have a strong defense so that if Article 5 is invoked, which states that if one NATO member is attacked, it's considered an attack by all, and all will pitch in to help, that they have a strong enough military to do that pitching in to help. So I think a wider context is a little important here in talking about that.
Okay. Speaking of scolding, the president also scolded Germany for its trade imbalance with the U.S. And will his tough talk, do you think, pay some dividends in the form of maybe better trade deals and adjusting trade tariffs?
You know, it's possible, but it seems like Europe is also doing a little bit of talking to Trump and trying to get him to go their way. I mean, of course, this is going to be a negotiation, and that's how Trump approached it. But it seems that's also how NATO members, the other NATO members, approached it. And they actually, for example, in the G7, they got Trump to sign something that agreed that protectionism
there was a bit of a,
and of course,
right. There was a bit of a carrot and stick approach to the president's negotiating style. The Wall Street Journal put it this way, and I'll read it up on the screen. In Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the West Bank, Mr. Trump took a conciliatory approach. He studiously avoided raising issues such as human rights that might have upset his hosts. But in Belgium and Italy, for gatherings with European leaders, Mr. Trump took a harsher tone, excoriated European leaders on defense policies, trade, and immigration. And then he withheld a public comment from Europe's security that he knew his hosts wanted to hear. In other words, the infamous Article 5, if any one country is attacked, we'll all come to that defense. What do you make of that?
You know, I think they're right in saying that Trump seemed to take two approaches, which would actually be perfectly fine if that was the way to get good deals made. You know, he's a negotiator. If it took different styles to make different deals with different people, great. But I don't think that worked here. And I think that, you know, it's very striking when the president goes to Saudi Arabia, gets this huge red carpet welcome, met at the airport, which, of course, President Obama was not. And this is a country in which women cannot drive. There are human rights abuses.
Right.
And then he goes to Europe and acts quite differently. And yes, scolding them, you know, the famous moment of him, you know, nudging the Montenegro leader out of the way.
It's true that it was a more conciliatory tone in Saudi Arabia, but he also urged them to drive out the terrorists, stop their financing, banish their violent ideology of hatred. I mean, that was the right tough tone and message, wasn't it?
Yes, and, you know, he reminded, the NATO of that. When he gave his speech at NATO, he noted, he said, hey, I just met with all these Middle Eastern leaders, and they agreed to stop funding extremism and terrorism.
Sure.
Now, I don't know if that's actually going to happen, but he's right that that is something important. And even if they're paying lip service and doing a little bit, that's better than nothing. And he was careful to remind them of that at NATO. And, you know, he mentioned, it's funny because in his speech at NATO, of course, he mentioned Article 5. The only time Article 5 has been invoked so far was after 9/11. And he was, you know, NATO kind of, I think, did a clever thing in opening a memorial to that they had a piece of the North Tower, sort of, they're trying to get Trump to celebrate Article 5 and do it. And he mentioned it in his speech, and he, appreciated everyone for support, but he never came out.
To get his endorsement on Article 5, I think. Got to leave it at that. Kelly Jane Torrance of the Weekly Standard. Good to see you. Thank you.
Good to see you. Thanks.
And British police making 2 more arrests today in connection with this week's deadly Manchester bombing that killed at least 22 people. That brings the total number of people in custody to 11. The arrests come as the UK lowers its terror threat level, but authorities urge citizens to remain vigilant. Rick Leventhal live from Manchester with more on this. Rick, this continues to be an evolving situation.
Absolutely, Laura. And authorities say they're still concerned that that suspected bomber may have built one more or more devices. And that's why, even though they did reduce the terror threat level from severe to critical to severe, they are asking the public to remain vigilant and be on high alert throughout this 3-day bank holiday weekend. And of course, Manchester police have been carrying on a very aggressive investigation, raiding at another location this morning using a controlled explosive to gain entry to a home. As you mentioned, 2 more arrests today. 14 locations are still being searched by police. The chief constable saying we have made significant progress in this fast-moving and complex investigation, working with the National Counterterrorism Policing Network and UK intelligence partners, and securing the arrests of 11 people who remain in custody. The level of resources we have available to us remains the same as we continue to take positive action, so you will notice additional officers, including armed officers, on patrol, especially at a number of events this weekend to ensure the security and safety of everyone. But it's important that people remain alert and vigilant. Authorities say that extra security will be posted at some 1,300 events over the weekend, including the Football Association Cup final, the rugby final, and concerts and other outdoor events. A lot of that security on display at Wembley Stadium in London today. You know, we've talked a lot about the young victims of this attack, but parents were killed too, including 2 mothers who were waiting for their children to leave that Ariana Grande concert. They released some balloons here at this memorial at St. Anne's Square in honor of those 2 mothers. One of the daughters talked about her loss.
For 18 hours, we was wondering where they were, looking for them, going around hospitals, showing pictures. I had friends of mine offering to do it. We had a whole search party out there, and all along they was in the building.
So the mourning continues here, and so does the investigation, Laura, and this country does remain on high alert.
All right, Rick Leventhal for us on the ground there in Manchester. Thank you so much.
ISIS now claiming responsibility for a deadly attack on Coptic Christians in Egypt. Gunmen targeting a bus carrying Christians yesterday, killing at least 29 people. The victims were on their way to a monastery south of Cairo. Kitty Logan is in London with the very latest. Hi, Kitty.
Hi, Greg. Well, there has been widespread condemnation of this attack. President Trump described it as a merciless slaughter. Now, these militants fired on a bus carrying those Coptic Christians as they travelled through the desert to a monastery south of Cairo. Witnesses describe 8 to 10 attackers dressed in military uniforms and wearing masks. We now know they were ISIS fighters. These gunmen reportedly fired at close range at the windows of the bus before getting on board. They shot men on there first, but some young children were also killed. Now, some funerals have already been held. Thousands of mourners turn out to pay their respects, vowing not to be intimidated by the attacks and pledging to defend their religion. Now, the Egyptian government has promised to strike back, and it has done just that, with 2 days of airstrikes on ISIS targets in neighbouring Libya. A military spokesperson says several militant training camps have been destroyed. Now, President Trump has said the US would stand with Egypt in its fight against terrorism. And the Egyptian authorities have also put extra security measures in place to protect Christians in the area of the attack. There have been several ISIS attacks on Christians in Egypt lately. This was the 4th in recent months, and ISIS has vowed to escalate those attacks, in particular since the Pope visited the country several months ago. And yesterday, the Pope responded to this attack by praying for those victims, saying they had died for their faith. Greg.
All right. Kitty Logan live in London. Kitty, thank you.
Well, there are major headaches for travelers worldwide today. British Airways canceling all of its flights out of Heathrow and Gatwick airports in London, two major international hubs. A company-wide computer problem has caused these severe delays in congested airports. The airline says it is experiencing a major IT failure and that there is no evidence of a cyber attack. Everything from check-in lines to the company's mobile app and call centers all being affected. British Airways hopes to begin restoring services on Sunday. What a mess.
Well, a pair of Good Samaritans trying to help two women on a commuter train pay for it with their lives when another passenger suddenly goes on a vicious stabbing spree. We'll have a live report just ahead. And Senate Republicans preparing for a big showdown over a controversial provision in their bill to repeal and replace Obamacare.
According to that report, we need to bring down the cost of coverage. And we need to revitalize the market so that people have real choices and real access to affordable health care. That's what our plan will do.
Welcome back. The Defense Department now identifying the Army Ranger killed in Syria yesterday. The Pentagon says Specialist Etienne Murphy died of injuries sustained during a vehicle rollover. The 22-year-old soldier was from Loganville, Georgia. That incident happening in northeastern Syria. It's under investigation. The specialist, Murphy, was assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment.
And Senate Republicans battling over pre-existing conditions in the fight to overhaul Obamacare. Some GOP lawmakers reportedly want to include the waivers from the House bill that would allow states to opt out of the clause, banning higher premiums for people with pre-existing conditions. Now, according to the Congressional Budget Office, that could mean some people could see their premiums go through the roof. Congressman Jason Lewis is a member of the House Budget Committee, Education and Workforce Committee as well. Welcome to you, sir. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Laura.
Hello. All right. So let's get right to it. One of the biggest concerns for the public and challenges for lawmakers is how to break down and handle these pre-existing conditions. There are many Americans who are very worried right now about how their premiums will go up, especially now that the CBO has released its report saying they, in fact, have reason to worry. You've just put out an article on TwinCities.com. I was reading through it earlier, outlining a list of what you see about the myths, you say, about the AHCA. So what are some of those? Tell us about them.
Well, this is the week that HHS put out a report that said under Obamacare from 2013 to last year, premiums more than doubled. They went up 105%. Under the Affordable Care Act, Laura, we priced everyone as though they were sick. Everybody had to buy on the government exchanges the most expensive plan possible. What happened was young and healthy people couldn't afford it. They dropped out of the insurance pools, and the insurance industry has a death spiral. Aetna and Humana say we're out of the Obamacare exchanges next year. So nobody's there to subsidize anybody else. By allowing the industry to price a policy that fits me best, a young and healthy person best, you get more young and healthy people back in the insurance pools to subsidize the sick. That's the only way to get this plan to work. That's the only way insurance can work.
You've been in this for quite a while. I'm curious, what did you make of the CBO score overall? You had a chance to look at the report.
Well, sure. First thing you have to understand is this is the same outfit, the CBO, and they work hard. But they said that the Affordable Care Act would cover 26 million people by this year. It's actually 10 million people. They've overestimated the ACA and underestimated us. But I will say this. In the report, they say premiums will be lower 4% to 30%. In states that apply for waivers so they can price the product that suits the customer, those premiums could drop up to 30% in this report. The report also says the deficit will go down by $120 billion. So contrary to the spin by the opponents, and remember, one thing everybody ought to remember, the very same people who are criticizing health care reform now are the very same folks that told us Obamacare would work. In Minnesota, premiums have gone up 55%, 60%. The state had to bail out the exchange here. You've got insurance companies dropping 100,000 people off their plans. This current system is untenable. So we've got to have real health care reform, and that's what we're doing.
You know, Mr. Lewis, with the ongoing fight over pre-existing coverage, a lot of Americans watching this, listening now, wonder how is all of this going to affect any of the real chances of getting a health care bill done? How do you see it?
Well, first of all, the American Health Care Act bans any denial of pre-existing conditions. That's a canard that's been out there for some time. It bans denial of coverage for pre-existing conditions. All it says is the industry can suit a plan that's best suited to the customer. And that means young and healthy people will have lower premiums and they'll get back in the market, as I say. So without the undoing of these price controls and allowing the market to function, you can't price everybody as though they're sick. We've seen what happens. If you really want to cover the sickest Americans, allow the prices to fluctuate so we get young, healthy people back in the insurance pools to subsidize the older and the sick.
And real quick before I let you go, how do you help people understand how the waivers work and how it could affect their families? A lot of people are trying to wrap their head around this and know how it's going to affect their children, their spouses. How do you explain the waiver part of this?
That's a great question. All the waivers do is allow the industry, as I say, to pool risk and price risk. But understand, no one can be charged a penny more unless they stop paying their premiums. All right. No one can be charged a dime more than anybody else unless they stop paying their premiums. And by the way, that is the same policy that was in Kennedy-Kassenbaum in HIPAA in 1996.
And I wonder, has this been frustrating for you? How frustrating has it been, if it has been?
Yeah, the misinformation is very, very frustrating. This is real health care reform, and what's especially frustrating, Laura, is right now no one has a clue what we're going to do if we don't reform health care. All of the critics have no plans. They're looking at this debacle in health care right now. It is our responsibility and the responsibility of people who are serious about governing to reform health care in a meaningful way, and that's what we're doing.
All right, Mr. Lewis, thank you so much for your time. We've got to leave it right there. Always great to have you on the program.
My pleasure.
All right. Greg.
Well, the president heading home right now after his 9-day trip overseas. Waiting for him, fresh concerns about his campaign's alleged ties to Russia. Our legal panel is here to weigh in on that. And a train ride in Oregon turns deadly. How 2 passengers sacrificed their lives to stop an apparent hate crime.
When I think about a day that I was so proud to be an American, I think about
Police in Oregon identifying the man accused of fatally stabbing 2 people and injuring a 3rd on a commuter train. Portland police say that Jeremy Joseph Christian attacked the passengers when they tried to stop him from yelling racial slurs at 2 Muslim women on the train. Witnesses say Christian was spewing hate speech and ranting against a number of religions and ethnicities before the attack. Will Carr live in our West Coast newsroom with those details. Will, what a terrible story.
That's right, Laura, and the victims didn't even know the suspect. They only stepped in to defend the 2 Muslim women and to try to calm the man down. Confrontation broke out Friday afternoon on a Portland train. Authorities say 35-year-old Jeremy Joseph Christian was hurling hate-filled slurs at 2 Muslim women, one of whom was wearing a hijab. That's when the Good Samaritan stepped in to de-escalate the situation, but Christian allegedly pulled out a knife and attacked. One victim was pronounced dead on the scene. Another died at the hospital. A 3rd was stabbed but is expected to survive. Take a listen to one witness describe the chaos.
I was scared.
Say what?
I was so scared. You know, and so I knocked on the door at the driver to let him know. People calling for help for the 911. So we called 911. Almost everybody called 911.
Authorities said that Christian fled on foot. They caught up to him a short time later, and he was engaging in a verbal confrontation with the officers that was caught on camera. Christian was taken into custody without further incident. He's now charged with a number of crimes, including aggravated murder, attempted murder, intimidation in the 2nd degree, and a felon in possession of a restricted weapon. He's being held without bail as investigators continue to question him as to what led up to the attack, and he's set to appear in court first thing on Monday. Laura.
Good Samaritans just trying to do the right thing, paying with it for their lives. All right, Will Carr, thank you so much for that report. Greg.
As President Trump makes his way back to Washington, new questions swirling about the Trump campaign and alleged ties to Russia. There's a new report by the Washington Post claiming senior aide and son-in-law to the president, Jared Kushner, discussed a secret back channel of communication with the Kremlin. That conversation reportedly took place with a Russian ambassador at Trump Tower last year. Let's bring in David Bruno and Keisha Hebben. Both are defense attorneys and former prosecutors. Can we all agree it's not a crime to talk to a Russian, nor is it a crime to initiate secure communications with a foreign government, including the Russians? Keisha?
While it's not a crime, I agree, Greg. The issue that I see is that why would he propose that it be back-channeled and that it take place in
done all the time?
But in the climate of what they're already being accused of helping Trump.
But it happened in December, apparently, before the administration took office, so there wasn't that climate.
Right, but I think that goes to the point of suspicions that people have. So I feel like this needs to be investigated. We don't know enough to say it's a crime, but it needs to be investigated.
He might have wanted better cooperation in the war against terrorists in Syria and get the aid and assistance of the Russians.
I'm just not buying that.
All right, David, back-channel communications are not uncommon, as I mentioned. In fact, many past presidents have done it, notably John F. Kennedy. In fact, it was a back-channel secret communication that diffused the Soviet American-Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, no question. And actually, National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster said a statement today that this wasn't out of the ordinary and that it's done. But if I can, on the timeline of this, because it is actually important that this happened in December, because this was the transition period.
Right.
And in fact, Jared Kushner was designated the point of contact for foreign officials that wanted to get in touch with the president-elect.
Right.
That was within his responsibility. So the fact that he had any communications with the ambassador or any Russian officials is not a problem whatsoever.
All right, but let's flip to something else that has been controversial this week. The law governing the special counsel says he can only investigate crimes, limited jurisdiction, crimes only. Wrongdoing, sorry, crimes only. And when you look at the order appointing him special counsel, it says, quote, investigate any links or coordination between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. That's not a crime. There is no such crime as collusion in a political campaign, only an antitrust law for things like price fixing.
Well, due to the fact that there's already an investigation about the Russians helping President Trump win his presidency, they have to investigate, because if it wasn't for that investigation, this would not have come out.
Let's say there
was
extensive collaboration between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Show me a statute.
But there may be espionage. We don't know that.
Espionage?
So, yes, because why does
conveying military secrets and national security secrets? They didn't even have it back then.
But we don't know what those conversations entail. We don't know why he needed these conversations to be so secretive. And it just doesn't sit well with me, and it doesn't sit well with a lot of citizens.
Is there anybody in Washington who hasn't had a sit-down conversation with Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador? For goodness sakes, that's his job, isn't it?
Apparently not. Okay, but here's the point in my response to you. First of all, these investigations are secret investigations, and they should be. And it's one of the big concerns that the president has, and these are these leaks. You know, so
those are the crimes.
Yeah,
the leaks,
a lot of what we're
that's
hearing
a crime.
and the information that we have to use in this analysis are from leaks. So the fact of the matter is, we do not know what the FBI has found in their investigation. We do not know what the Deputy Attorney General has on his desk, and for the reason. So yes, that order may be a little vague, and to your point, we don't know what's in the investigation itself.
The special counsel order also allows Robert Mueller to investigate, quote unquote, any other matters. It's the all-encompassing phrase that basically allows a special counsel to run rampant in limitless directions, which may mean that this will morph into the Trump-Comey conversation and all these allegations of obstruction of justice. If the president says to the FBI director, gee, I hope you can clear Michael Flynn because he's a good guy, that doesn't amount to obstruction of justice, a specific intent crime, does it?
No, it doesn't, but we have to have that separation of powers. There has to be checks and balances. I understand the president has power, but the FBI director needs to act independently as well, because if a crime has taken place, you can't just go by the direction of the president to say, okay, well, I'm going to leave this alone.
Doesn't the president have the constitutional authority not only to hire and fire the FBI director, but to tell him what to investigate and what not to investigate.
Yeah, certainly has that authority to have communications, especially if the president himself is not a target. And that's maybe the reason we saw in the letter to Director Comey that you have told me on 3 occasions that I was not a target.
And now you're fired.
Yes, because it's relevant, I guess, because if he's not a target, then it's a communication with the director of the FBI, and I guarantee every other president has had communications with the director on these points.
JFK and LBJ were forever telling J. Edgar Hoover to do this investigation and stop that investigation. It goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson and the trial of Aaron Burr. All right, thank you. Now I'm getting in the weeds, aren't I? Wow. I don't know where that popped out. David Bruno, Keisha, having great to see you guys. Thank you.
Good to see you, Greg.
Pleasure always.
Thank you.
All right, President Bush teaming up with an old friend to protect their common legacy. The fight that's uniting a rock star and a former president. Coming up next. And Hillary Clinton takes aim at President Trump during a commencement speech more than 6 months after she lost the election. So here's the question. Is it time to let it go? A fair and balanced debate coming up.
Bush reconnecting with an old ally to protect one of his most important causes, which is the fight against AIDS. Bono, the lead singer of U2, stopped by the former president's ranch yesterday. There they are together. Mr. Bush posting this photo online. The rock star and the former president have both worked tirelessly to battle AIDS all over the world. They spoke out together against potential budget cuts in Washington that could put the fight at risk.
Hillary Clinton bashing President Trump in a commencement address at her alma mater, Wesley College, on Friday. The former Democratic presidential candidate not pulling any punches some 6 months after her election loss. Listen.
We were furious about the past presidential election of a man whose presidency would eventually end in disgrace with his impeachment for obstruction of justice. After firing the person running the investigation into him at the Department of Justice.
Those remarks happening at Wellesley. Joining me is journalist and radio talk show host Jamila Bey and Fox News contributor Rachel Campos Duffy. All right, ladies, welcome to you. I am very anxious to hear your reaction to all of this. I'll start with you, Jamila. Many have described this speech as particularly aggressive for Clinton. The Washington Post even described it as remarkably aggressive anti-Trump. What'd you make of it?
I thought Hillary Clinton gave a rousing speech to her base. She came home to her alma mater, and these are young women who are going to be the captains of industry soon. They're going to be the ones who are running for and winning office all over the country. We saw them descend on Washington with their little pink hats on and decide to make it known, we women who are graduating, congrats to you grads, are going to make a difference in this world. And Hillary Clinton drew a parallel to this moment in time, to the moment in time where she herself was a young graduate with the world before her. I think aggressive is, I wouldn't use that word at all. I think, you know, powerful and certainly energetic is the word that I would use to describe that speech. Go grads.
All right, Rachel, I've had you on the program before. I have a feeling I know what you thought about it, but I do want to ask you what you thought about, you know, let's start with just the soundbite that we played of Hillary Clinton bringing up a time in our nation's past when she says they were furious about a presidential election of a man whose presidency would eventually end in disgrace overall. What'd you make of the speech?
Well, first of all, energized is not what I would see. She started this, what I would say, she started the speech actually with a coughing fit that required them to bring her water and a lozenge. So quite the juxtaposition to how strong our president looked this week traveling, you know, all the way to the Middle East and Europe when she just hopped over to Massachusetts, one state over, after resting and drinking Chardonnay and cleaning her closets like she talked about in her speech. You would presume she'd be in better shape. That said, she sounds resentful. She sounds stuck. She sounds like she's ready for revenge, which I think is a perfect analogy for where the Democratic Party is. They are not being introspective. They're not asking the questions they need to be asking about why they lost an election that really they should have won. Why did they lose all these working class voters in the Rust Belt? why did so many Democrats change their ticket and take a chance on a guy with no political experience? And I think that's a problem not just for Hillary, but also for the party. I think that's very emblematic of where they're at, and I think why they might lose again.
Well, Jamila Clinton also asked the graduates to consider when people in power, she says, invent their own facts and attack those who question them, saying that it marks the beginning of the end of a free society. That was in her speech, obviously another stab at the president. You think that was fair?
Absolutely. Let's be real. We live in a time right now where we're seeing the playbook that everybody who's ever read Orwell understands well. You repeat something over and over until it becomes a fact. Look, you can love Trump, you can hate Trump, but what you cannot do is invent your own alternate reality. How many people show up at an event is a measurable metric that can be seen, examined, and proven. You cannot say one thing, have it disproven, and then go, oh, well, that's just our alternative fact. That's an alternative reality. Saying such a thing on a campus was a brilliant move on her part. Facts matter. Facts are important.